Now I'm going to show you some data from the Lands hives on fall treatment specifically. So what does it look like if you do or don't treat in the fall? So the first one that I want to show you, this is cumulative mite fall. It's expressed a little bit differently than the graph that I showed you before. Basically, 100% of the mite fall that we saw happens at the end, regardless of how many actual mites fell. But what these curves show you is where most of the mite drop occurred. So at what time that actually happened. And in this experiment, unlike the virus one, this is an efficacy study. So there was a focal treatment, which is 2 strips of Formic Pro, and then we did a critical treatment. So that was a follow-up treatment with oxalic acid to see how many Varroa were left in the colony after the treatment of interest. In this case, in 2024, we applied treatment on September 24th. So it was actually fairly late in the year. You can see in the treated group, which is the yellow line, that's 2 strips of Formic Pro. There's a large increase in the proportion of mites that fell at that time. Not surprising. Formic Pro is effective, so this really just demonstrates that again. Yeah. The control colonies, they also saw some mite drop. The levels are quite high in these colonies at this time of year, so September 24th. So there is some mite drop on the sticky boards, and that's just natural mite death that's occurring.
Sure. So a Varroa mite lives approximately 100 days, just on average. So when you see natural Varroa death, that's like 1% per day, because 100 days, 1% per day. But also the population is still expanding at this point. So you're going to see this effect. It makes perfect sense.
Yeah. So we see them both increasing, but the Formic Pro group, of course, is increasing a lot faster because the product is actually killing mites and then they're falling on the sticky board. Then when we apply the oxalic acid critical treatment, we're applying it according to the Canadian recommendations, which is 2 grams per hive, sublimated inside of the cavity on the 18th, 23rd, and 28th, so about 4 days apart again. And when we do that, starting on the first application, you can really see the control colonies just ramp right up. And that's because there's a lot of mites left in there because we haven't been killing them with anything else before then. In the Formic Pro group, though, there's barely an increase. So there's not much happening there because the Formic Pro really took care of most of the mite load there.
The mites aren't there to kill.
Yeah. Right. So applying a fall treatment, if you're going to do it, in this case, it's September. You can see that there's a lot of mite death there, and that really is in the middle of winter brood rearing. Whereas by the time you get to October 18th, 23rd, and 28th, you've passed most of the winter brood being reared by that point at this, where we are specifically in Ontario.
So we can see from this graph by October 9th, the bees are then able to raise very nice healthy brood going forward because their mites are been taken out of the picture essentially, as far as you'll get at least one good clean brood cycle out. And the bees, they, as a biological organism, they want a certain colony size, a cluster size. So from my own observances, we often see an egg-laying surge once the Varroa population has been removed from the colony. It seems to reinvigorate the bees, and with that new vigor, they're very focused on getting out a healthy cluster.
So this is the mite fall data. None of that's really that surprising. We put a product in that killed mites, and then we put a different product in that also killed mites, and it looks different across those two groups. Right. This is the alcohol wash data. So maybe you can start thinking about how this applies to what you see in your own colonies if you're using alcohol wash as your monitoring method. So between September 17th and 19th, when we did this investigation, we see a pretty healthy mite population there. That's around 10%. So that's 10 per 100 bees in our adult worker bee population, which is quite high. Right. So great for running this kind of research, because we really need to have mites in there to see if things work or if they don't work.
That's right.
We put our Formic Pro treatment in on September 24th, and then we went back into the colonies and did another assessment between the 17th and 18th of October. And in this case, we can see that the mite load in the adult bee population in the treated group has gone down to very close to zero. So it's definitely below 3%, but it's close to zero. However, in the untreated group, it's increased to now about 32.5%.
On average, yeah.
Huge.
It's quite a range, some up over 40%.
Huge.
Yes. Yeah.
Now, this is really where the timing of the treatment comes in, because you can see, once again, we've applied this critical treatment, the oxalic acid vapor, but this is October again. And when we do our final assessment, which is at the end of October, so just after the end of the critical treatment, we see that actually that the level in the control group that wasn't treated with Formic Pro has come down. And in fact, it's looking pretty decent. It's a little bit higher than the treatment group, but it's decently low going into winter. And you might think, well, okay, we've taken care of the problem. We've gotten rid of the mites here.
You're still running about 6%, but those are all mites that were in the brood. They would have had an impact on the health of the cluster.
Yeah. So I think that's the key takeaway here, because then if we look at what happens after during the winter. So we've got, by the time we got to winter, we had 7 in the Formic Pro treated group that made it into winter, but only 5 in the untreated control groups. And I will say that the untreated control groups were looking pretty sad by the time we got there. Not
it's unfortunate
great.
Part of research is...
Indeed. But even with that huge reduction in mites due to the critical treatment with oxalic acid, which was quite effective at that point because there's not a whole bunch of brood there, even with that reduction, none of those colonies made it through winter.
Yeah.
Whereas 6 of our 7 colonies made it through winter, and not only made it through winter, but were viable in spring. So I only counted them as surviving if they had a functional queen in the spring. So if you were a drone layer, I'm sorry, you weren't counted in that number. So 6 out of 7 Formic Pro treated colonies made it through, none of the untreated control colonies, despite the fact that, again, the mite levels don't look that different by the time we're finished there.
Just out of curiosity, how many were in the groups at the start?
In this study, it was 8, actually.
8
we started
groups.
out with 8.
So that's very normal that, like, through the season, especially under the stress of a research study where you're into the colonies a lot, that you might lose 1 or 2 just through the manipulations that are going on and all these other things. So if to have a starting n equals 8 and then you go into winter with 7, I would say that that's pretty normal. And then with your untreated control, again, 8 have dropped to 5, but at the end of the day, you know, you started with 8 and you got 6 viable in the spring in the Formic Pro treated colony, despite all the manipulations and work that goes into conducting a study. So these are numbers that are very typical of you know, just normal beekeeping operations. That this is, you know, you might start with 8 colonies, you put 7 of them into winter, and then in the spring you've got 6 to work with, and that's very easy to build back up to your starting numbers again.
Yeah.
So with the untreated control, none viable in the spring, that's doomed.
Yeah.
Yes.
A couple more slides that I'd like to discuss with you, and these are both also from the lay-in study that we did, and so this is last year's data, where we just looked at the total brood area. So this was the fall treatment specifically. People are sometimes concerned about using things like formic acid because of possible negative brood impacts, but here in this study, we can see that the level of brood, and this is the Liebefeld method, so this is where you divide the frame surface into a certain number of squares, and then you are counting how many of those squares are filled completely, or what percentage of them are filled with whatever you're interested in. In this case, it's brood. So we start out by having equal amounts of brood across these two treatment conditions. So that's the Formic Pro group and the untreated control group. We put our treatment in on September 24th, and then we look at the level of brood in those two groups on October 17th and 18th, and we see that actually both of the groups have declined, but that's not surprising. It's fall, so they're ramping down their brood production for the year. But the untreated control group has actually declined a little bit more than the treatment group, which is maybe a little bit surprising. And then by the time we get to our final assessment, which is after, again, we apply that oxalic acid critical treatment, there's actually a big difference. So whereas the Formic Pro treated group stays pretty constant between the 17th and 18th of October and the 30th of October. The control colonies that didn't get any treatment, and I mentioned that they weren't looking so great by the time we got to the end of the study, they really don't have a lot of brood happening at this point. So
the vigor of the colony has been affected by the presence of Varroa, and its knock-on effect is you don't have a good base of brood that will make up your winter cluster by end of October.
Yeah.
Okay.
And even though you've applied a treatment here, and we showed with the alcohol wash that it was effective, this critical oxalic acid, it was, to my mind, and I think the data bear this out too late to have the impact that it needed to have
For colony survival.
Yeah.
And we saw that in the spring.
Exactly. And then the last thing that I just wanted to touch on briefly too, because these were the two things that were related to colony survival, right? Was the adult population and the brood. If we look at the adult population across these two treatment conditions, they're actually the same at all 3 time points, so the same as each other, even though they're declining here, but then by October 30th, they're roughly equivalent. So the populations really weren't different. So the big difference really was actually in the amount of brood that was in these colonies.
And the health of the population.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, so. That of course these data don't tell you if these were sad bees or happy bees. They're just bees.
But the outcome is the Formic Pro treated colonies were viable in the spring.
Absolutely. And that's what we want.
Yeah.
Okay.
So Heather, this has been a good discussion, but I want to point out to people what our key takeaways were, just to summarize it. Essentially, we now have had 30 years of dealing with Varroa, and knowing what we know, it should really be considered a minor inconvenience. If you treat twice a year with the windows that we've discussed here in Canada, which is like the first half of May and then again the first half of September, you've bought yourself 4 months between treatment periods and protected the populations of bees that are of economic significance. The summer bees that will do the pollination services if you're into pollination and then bring in your honey crop, and then the winter bees which will bring your colony through until the next spring. So those are the key takeaways. If you didn't treat in the spring, you'll have to treat twice a year anyway. So probably your Varroa populations will reach a point of needing treatment sometime in early August if you skip the spring treatment, and then you'll have to treat again come mid-September. And so timely treatment with Formic Pro twice a year, that should protect your bees and have healthy colonies for the foreseeable future. Over this series of 5 videos, Heather shared with us her research on our IPM method, where we're protecting populations of bees rather than monitoring Varroa mite levels. And this research supports what we've shown you in the field as we work through the beekeeping season of 2025. Thanks for watching another episode of Behind the Hive. Please feel free to add your questions or concerns in the comment section. Give us a like if you're enjoying these videos, and we look forward to being with you again in the future.